Good afternoon and welcome back. Here you are to session 7. Can you believe it? We're almost through with 2 full days of this. It's really flown by. But here as we come into right after the lunch hour, we're hoping to have a very engaging and interesting panel for you as you think about either your lunch or your dinner, wherever you happen to be located in the world. So as you've learned in your time here at PEPR, that privacy really is one of those most demandingly interdisciplinary of topics for either research or practice. As you've seen and you've heard in so many panels, including the fabulous panel we just got done with on medical data, privacy engineering brings together everyone from doctors and legal experts through to people with enviable knowledge of the GDPR or anonymization in computer science. The expertise needed to create all of these fabulous privacy products, it's really going to come from teams that blend all of that together. They're going to have to blend research knowledge and practical knowledge together in really new and exciting ways. But as we've learned, and as we all know from our own experience here, these teams are going to inevitably confront one of the growing pains that not only do we hear about often at the Future of Privacy Forum, but often you experience in your daily life. And that is that, well, researchers don't always talk to practitioners. Practitioners don't always talk to researchers. Sometimes we struggle just to figure out whether or not our teams are speaking the same language when they say basic words like privacy, right? So the purpose of this panel is to try to identify some of those pain points and to really explore that further with the fabulous experts we've convened today. So at the Future of Privacy Forum, for the past 2 years, we've been working with the generous funding from the National Science Foundation under an Applied Privacy Research Coordination Network grant. And what we're trying to do is, well, kind of like what we're trying to do in this panel today, which is to bring in really high flyers from the research side of privacy and experts and fabulous privacy heroes from the industry side of privacy. So without further explanation, let me tell you who you're going to hear from, because I am sure you're going to want to, take a seat and really tune in for this. This afternoon, I am so honored to be moderating a panel of really true stars in the privacy world. We have recently coming from Georgia Institute of Technology's Distributed Data Intensive Systems Lab, and now an assistant professor of computer science at Denison University, Stacy Truex. She's joining us to tell us more about her research on machine learning systems that protect against privacy attacks. We also have from the Technical University of Berlin's Information Systems Engineering Research Group, Professor Frank Pallas, who will be giving us some insights into some work that he and his collaborator, Elias Grunwald, shared via Slack yesterday, specifically talking about their TILT toolkit, a GDPR-aligned transparency, information, language, and toolkit for practical privacy engineering. These two amazing academic side speakers are joined by really 2 industry privacy leaders, which I'm sure need no introduction to this group, but just in case you haven't met either the fabulous Dr. Edward Yu or Sheila Cole-Klisher, let me give you a few notes and tones of who you're talking with or learning from this afternoon. Sheila Cole-Klisher is of Kinesso. She is the Global Chief Digital Responsibility and Public Policy Officer for Kinesso, where she helps to ensure that practices operating at the leading edge of digital technology are consistent with the principles of responsible, respectful, and proportionate and fair data uses. Lawrence Yu is Google's Director of Privacy for Product and Engineering since 2013, and is a distinguished privacy engineer. For all of you who are wondering where the engineer was here, you've got him, right? He joined Google's Systems Infrastructure Group in 2004 and leading the log storage and analysis team. He's been an advisor to product, engineering, policy, and legal teams across Google on matters related to large-scale data analysis, data management, security, and privacy technology. Currently, he drives privacy initiatives within Google, strategic technical direction, and works with a team of other privacy engineers to help establish design and development practice. So thank you so much, everyone who's joining me this afternoon. It's fabulous to see you. After so many emails of contact, it's so great to put faces with names. But let's go ahead and just get this started and take that deep dive. I'm going to give each of the panelists a couple of questions and allow them to elaborate. then we're hoping that we can get some engagement in Slack about some of the things that they're talking about, but also that some of our panelists can go ahead and engage with one another. So Frank, recognizing that you're staying up perhaps the latest here and joining us from Berlin, you'll take the first question. So you and your co-author, Elias Grunwald, created what you called TILT, right? Which is a transparency information language and toolkit, which you argue is going to help data subjects to see the whole picture of personal data uses that are often trapped in the dense legal language of privacy policies. So what inspired you and Elias to create TILT? How can TILT help privacy practitioners, maybe Lawrence, maybe Sheila, to achieve their goals of protecting data subjects and to help fulfill their company's business goals?
Yeah, thanks for featuring our work so prominently. Like every piece of technology that we develop in the privacy context, TILT started with one of the well-known privacy principles. So we have a couple of principles, way more than just data minimization and so on, and with the notion that this principle is implemented in practice in a dysfunctional manner. In this case, it was transparency. And with regard to transparency, there are a couple of obligations that data controllers have to fulfill, particularly in the GDPR or in other regulations, like they have to announce what data is collected, for which purpose, how long it is stored, and so on and so on. And the intention behind these regulations is that data subjects shall be able to act in a well-informed and self-determined manner. That is the idea behind that. And in practice, these obligations for transparency are typically implemented in a way that nobody actually makes use of, namely in written privacy policies. So everybody knows those written privacy policies that are meant to inform us, but well, who of us ever scrolled through the whole table of third parties that PayPal is transferring data to? Nobody. And the NY Times put it in a way like, we checked that and that many privacy policies, and they were an incomprehensible disaster and so on. And there is also this paper on the biggest lie on the internet that was just appearing on Slack, I think. So these are dysfunctional, these are, well, implemented in a dysfunctional way. And what we did was we were searching for an alternative, and there are alternatives that are discussed like privacy icons and so on, but these in turn are also having certain shortcomings. They are created from a purely design position, from a UX position, and they do not provide the expressiveness that regulations actually require. So they cannot transport what is needed to express. And in most cases, they do not care a lot about how the information that is to be provided shall be, well, codified in a technical manner. And what we did was we wanted to create a technical representation that is not this document-oriented way, but rather a more technical and more structured way. And we created a formal language, a structured language that is capable of expressing what regulations like the GDPR require us to do. On the other hand, there have been comparable approaches in the past, like P3P and so on, but these also do not allow to codify what regulations actually require. And we provide such a language, and we provide programming libraries around that and several further tools. And based on that, it is quite easy to, so once we are able to codify the respective information in this format, we are able to transport and present this in a couple of different ways. So we are currently playing around with the chatbot or with browser plugins or visualizations and so on. But we need at first a structured machine readable representation, and that's what TILT does.
Wow, so it sounds as if you're trying to develop things that are really be right there for subjects, for people whose data is used to understand. Right?
That's the intention, yes.
Okay, so Sheila, let me turn to you. So you work at the intersection of solutions development using all these digital technologies and responsible data use. So you just heard from Frank his discussion of how he's trying to develop solutions. But from your perspective, on the other side of writing some of those privacy policies, what are some of the hottest areas for development of tools and solutions for advancing responsible data use in your perspective?
Well, hi, Sarah. Thank you so much. And thank you, Frank. I love your work. I don't think that we have cracked the transparency nut yet. So by way of background, of course, Sarah, you and I know each other well. I'm a practitioner, been in the data field for 25 years. Lived in it, grew up in it, and have always practiced privacy in it. And I've seen a lot of change, a lot of innovation. And I say this, we are poised on the precipice of true transformation. And remember, we've come from the world of data, big data, data at velocity, variety, and volume. And I think that we've achieved data infinity, especially in the past year, the year of COVID, where our entire lives have become connected. Our personal life, our professional life, our social life, our community life, and for certain of us, even our religious lives. So here's where it's gotten us, and here's where my mind is. Data is a certainty. Data is a necessity. And in the digital age, as a whole world becomes connected and online, how we protect it has to be equally driven with technology, because computer code is the conduct. So that's where Frank's work becomes super critically important, is we've got to do the work of privacy with privacy enabling technology, and also things like, I'm going to pull a term of art over here, called privacy enhancing computation. So what's important to me, where I live and breathe, is I've changed my, and then this is important, the way you come at the privacy stuff. It's about data governance, data security, data accountability, and data use. And all of that, we are in the midst, or my team and I are in the midst of this transformation, looking for those pets, those privacy enhancing technologies to get us there. So we're doing things like advanced cryptography. We're leaning into our machine learning and our AI, or advanced algorithms, on understanding the nature of data, debiasing our data, debiasing our algorithms. And all of that serves this notion of responsible data use. We've got to have data. And I'm going to break it into two buckets. You need data that connects, and then you need data that describes. And both of those need these PETs, or the privacy enhancing computational environments, to get that work done. So what I'm very excited about is some of the new technologies around internal, what I think of as data X-raying, where I can deploy a program to crawl my systems and really do a technological accounting of where data sits, where it flows, what it is, and then equally, so that's an internal thing I'm very excited about. We've had startups that have come at that, but with very limited results. And now we're seeing, and I'm exploring, a range of providers that I think have really gone to the next level and given me a tool set that I can have data completely under control and completely accounted for. And then you can decide the use. That's internal. External, I think the cryptography treatments around the data interchange, because remember, in connected life, data has to flow, has to share, has to use, has to travel. Even a digital footprint spews out digital exhaust. So what happens with all of that? It's created, it's captured. Now what? It's useful, it's valuable, and if we use it for good purpose, in service to people, for benefits and to people, and value to societies, instead of harm, the first step is really, how do you control it and account for it so that you can plan out the good uses and good purpose. One other thought, and then I'll take a breath and hand it back, is we've come from a world where we've used the word proportionality, and that's a mathematical term that means X in relation to Y. What is that proportionality? We've reached a world in the digital age where it's not an effective term, because we're working with multivariates now, and we have a multivariate of stakeholders. It's now X in relation to Y and Z and A and B and D and G and F, etc. So we live in that world, and we're going to solve it with technology because the computer code is the conduct. And I too am staffing up with privacy engineers and an array of data scientists and technology to try to get us there, and partnering with people like Frank to solve the transparency challenge.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sheila. So I'm pretty sure your ears started burning somewhere in there, Stacy, as Sheila was talking about the uses of machine learning and, data infinity. As somebody who's trying to think of, machine learning, if somebody says data infinity, I'm like, oh, look, there's more stuff we can play with, right? But you come to this whole privacy thing from the lens of an academic computer scientist, research computer scientist. I mean, your ACM award-winning paper about a hybrid approach obviously pulled in some acknowledgements of the major ways in which we have a lot of different directions we can go to create better privacy preservation through machine learning. So what can you tell us about some of the recent research you're doing on privacy preserving machine learning? And what do you think is the next hot area for the next steps for this, for you and for the field itself?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Glad to discuss this hot area. In a lot of our work, I think in academia especially, we have a tendency to sort of discuss things on the extremes. We always want to have absolute guarantees, and we always think of everyone in the ecosystem as a bad guy in our sense of who might attack us. And in reality and in practice, there's a little bit more of a gray area, and we know who these participants are. Sometimes there is an entire reputation attached to the people who are interacting with our data and our data systems. And how can we leverage maybe our entire toolkit of reputation and trust, also with our privacy tools that are out there, to kind of come at a better optimized setting where we're getting our victories when it comes to privacy, but also in the accuracy of those machine learning systems, because that is sort of the #1 priority for a lot of those different users, right? It's not just that the data is there, but we want to use that data effectively. And so we need to understand how our use of the data might be vulnerable to attack, what degree that attack might be realistic, and what those attackers look like, and how we can leverage the ecosystem that we live in to optimize those trade-offs of efficiency, system needs, accuracy, and privacy. And so in our work, we look to leverage encryption and the known trust identities within an ecosystem to decrease the amount of noise we inject while still maintaining rigorous privacy guarantees using a formal mathematical framework. I'm sure a lot of people hear differential privacy being thrown around these days. The US Census used differential privacy this past year to try and make people feel better about their participation and that their privacy is being protected. But there is some accuracy loss when we inject noise using some of these tools. So how can we consider the real needs of different industry settings? And so that's something that we try and look at it when we're creating these machine learning systems, but it does require people to bring in a lot of expertise in the machine learning field, but also the privacy field, and then of course, whatever domain you're working in. So I think to the point that Sheila and Frank were both discussing, and maybe more of a granular data level also applies in these machine learning settings. How can we translate between people's needs, or even some of the legislative requirements coming out in sort of faster speed, and we've seen with GDPR, but also out of California? How can we translate between what those things say and what the technology is providing?
Interesting, that challenge of translating research into policy into engineering practices, and then coming all the way back around to figure out where those engineering practices that we develop in subsequent steps come back to policy. Well, that seems like something that you do. Well, friends, that's exactly what it seems like you might do there at that leading edge of software engineering and managing privacy and privacy engineering teams through Google. So reflecting on what your previous panelist said, what do you wish that up and coming privacy engineering researchers and privacy engineers themselves knew about the field? What do you wish they knew about the research in order to be able to, well, do privacy engineering well at Google?
Yeah, pretty broad question. First, thanks for having me on the panel. It's a pleasure to be here. There's a number of things I think we'd want to see from researchers and academicians, people who are working in pretty bright areas. I think, first of all, the field's expanding pretty greatly in so many different ways. Like we talk about privacy as though it's sort of a single area, but it's so cross-disciplinary now that whether you're working in computer-human interaction or if any kind of machine learning, there's just a really wide range. There's also a number of things that are affected from obviously legal theory and a lot of development in legislation and regulation. So I would say one thing that we are looking for is, I think, looking at different kinds of research that actually span more than just looking at data or processing inventories, even some of the computing research areas. It definitely is spanning over from the current areas around computer science research and then moving into areas that are related to science or law or sociology or biology and things like that. I think there's another area, which is just in terms of the scope of the problems themselves. They're just really quite broad, and I think we would like to see continued development. There's a really long range of projects that I think have started early on with not necessarily a clear understanding of how they would go into practice. So someone mentioned differential privacy as one. We obviously started and saw how that got developed early on. And there was a question of where we would put that into practice. So the end result, though, I think, is that we did see that get used, and we are using it internally in our products at Google. And that's actually super valuable. But sometimes those things take a long time. So, just understanding that research actually starts off into a lot of different areas, and you don't know exactly where it's going to end up or what kind of contributions you might make. I think it's always valuable to just keep plugging away at it in new areas as well. So, and then I think the last area just for me is I'm a software engineer by training. I'm a computer scientist. So mostly what I spent my time doing was understanding data structures, algorithm systems, and things like that. It's really more about computation. I think we have a really large interest in understanding more about data, especially personal data, since that seems to be the topic for today. We probably need to understand more about how to manage data itself and treat that as really more of a first-class object, as opposed to just thinking about computation as being the primary area. So I would encourage more research in that, and that would be really, really valuable, I think, for the entire industry.
Let me turn a little bit of what you've said, Lawrence, over to you, Sheila, and ask you, Lawrence just described that maybe we need to start treating data as the first class object. Maybe when we're talking about new research frontiers, new practice frontiers, that maybe that's where we need to turn our attention. Given what you've heard from Frank, from Stacy, and now from Lawrence, what would you say, whether or not in all of these fields, what would you say an area of research would help to soothe some of the pain points that you experience in terms of making this data infinity more responsible?
Thank you, Sarah, and Lawrence. Thank you for your comments. You've rang several bells that are very resonant for me. One of my remits here in my role is the acculturation around privacy values and around this notion of digital responsibility. So you said making data the first object. Forgot exactly how you said it, but I call that people-centeredness, and I think it's not just about how well we compute. The design ethos, the design value, the design intention. When we're talking about personal data, a pixel, a tag, an advertising string, whatever it is, campaign analytics, you're analyzing data in this context, data about people. And what I've said, and forgive me for the jargon and the sound bites, but that data deserves the same dignity that people deserve, that they should have. So that's the starting place, and that's the conversation I have with my scientists and my engineers and my AI specialists is, let's start there. That's really, really important. Then it gets us to another, and directly to your question, Sarah, one of the challenges that I continue to have is a language challenge. Words matter. Words hold our meaning. So if we could get to some common language, decide how to define this stuff, so common language, agreed upon definitions, then we can have very productive conversations that go very fast. So that is one of the things we keep bumping into, the deltas, even inside my own shop, even in the field, which we depend on the anonymization, pseudonymization, that advanced cryptography that I'm talking about that enables me to do my service work and service to brands around the world, to manage their data, to activate their data, to connect their data in the connected ecosystem across platforms and important partners to us, like Google, which is a huge and important partner for all of my work. I have to be able to do that in a way that Lawrence and his team finds accountable, responsible. But even there, even in cryptography, the definitional delta is a constant and ongoing challenge. So I really think that's the starting place, is common language, which leads to common taxonomy. And taxonomy you can write into a rules engine. You can then inform your ML or your AI, but I don't think that we have that. So I'm gonna say that that's probably my starting place.
Yeah, you're getting a lot of nods from around the panel. I think we would all agree, sometimes it is down to what in the world does this word mean, right? And then communicating that across teams, making that clear in your research, making it clear in your product descriptions. It's a huge challenge. So Stacy, you recently, completed your PhD and are now moving over to your assistant professor role at Denison. In your previous life as a graduate student, you were doing a lot of work with industry players, like for example, with IBM. In your future work, how much work are you going to be doing that sort of sits at that interface between collaboration with industry? And how do you feel that collaboration with industry will help you to advance your own research purposes, and vice versa, that you can help to serve industry needs, say, from people like Knessa?
Yeah, I would hope that almost all of my work can be motivated by industry needs, because I think that's where you can have the most immediate impact and really get people out there using your work and kind of changing the needle in real time. And I would think, not to beat a dead horse here, but it is that language and that communication that I think is the biggest pain points that I experience whenever I come at a meeting or I enter a room where we're discussing something that's been discussed within the echo chamber of researchers, and then we bring in other players trying to get an actual product into use. It is those parameters, those interchanges between privacy and the machine learning system that sometimes the players are saying, can't you just set this parameter for me? Can you just tell me what this is for? The researchers are only thinking about experimentation, sort of a one iteration. I'm only going to train this machine learning model once. The players will train it multiple times in real life. They want suggestions for different settings. We sort of shy away from setting different privacy parameters, and sort of that language is a challenge that I think is really important and highlights how important it is to create systems that are customizable, that you can bring into a wide variety of settings for a wide variety of needs that the industry players have.
Sarah, I'll just jump in and say, to Stacy's point, when you do get that common language, when you get the common language and everybody agrees, you can do rapid understanding, rapid exchange. It also, in the digital age, in connected life, in the connected world, it allows for interoperability. So if we have these privacy enhancing technologies that are, we have common understanding and common language around, then we can use those better, faster, more effectively in the interoperable, digitally connected world. So really fundamental stuff Stacy's talking about.
Couldn't agree more. So I wonder whether or not there's a bridge also to some of the transparency work that you're doing, Frank, which is like, you can't talk about making things transparent without using that tool of language, right? We have to be able to express what's in the GDPR and what data subject is, what data is being gathered, all of that without language. So thinking about the conversation about a unified language, maybe a taxonomy around privacy, what are some of the other areas at the intersection of the research that you do and compliance that you think are ripe for additional research?
Oh, a lot. So I 90% agree with the language thing, not 100%, but 90%, because sooner or later you arrive at the point where privacy, there is this nice paper of privacy being an essentially contested concept and so on. And then this notion jumps in. But what I think is quite relevant, or two quite relevant fields or classes of things that should be addressed in future are first, that we have to notion the existence of second-order non-functional properties of privacy technology. So typically in enterprise systems engineering, you distinguish between functional properties, which is the system does what it's intended to do and so on, and non-functional properties, which is how the system does it, performant, in a privacy-friendly manner, and so on. And when we're talking about privacy-related technologies, which are basically meant to serve a non-functional property, these privacy technologies have functional properties. So from that perspective, the provision of a certain privacy functionality is a functional property. And they also have non-functional properties, like how performant are they? Can we actually say that this mechanism costs 10% in database throughput? How developer friendly are they? How well do they integrate with typical development stacks and paradigms used in enterprises? That is one thing where the academic side of the story fails, I think. So in academic privacy research, we typically develop novel crypto mechanisms and so on, novel protocols and so on. But when these shall be adopted in practice, they have to fit into typical development practices, stacks, and so on. So when we develop a database a database extension that is made to serve purpose limitation, for instance, we have to have in mind that real world systems are not approaching the database directly, but use some sort of intermediate layer, such an object relational mapper or so, and that is not part of what is actually very prominent in academic research. And I think there we have to do a lot more alignment with typical organizational and procedural paradigms. Like we cannot do a well-planned privacy design or so when we have agile practices with distributed decoupled DevOps teams, for instance, and so on and so on. So there is a lot of stuff to do. And on the other hand, I think we should focus way more on those privacy principles that are not data minimization and security. So transparency is one of them, purpose limitation. So how many technical work do you know that actually address the principle of purpose limitation? So there is a bit, but not that much. And there are other principles that also need to be addressed in order to help enterprises fulfill their obligations. And we in the academic domain have to recognize that there are more needs than just making things anonymous and encrypted.
If I might just jump in a little bit, I think this is a really fascinating topic for us. I think what we see, and I might even challenge Frank a little bit on the idea of whether or not there's a functional requirement for privacy or non-functional requirement. I sort of feel like and then what Sheila was saying also about the people orientation of in our case, let's call it a product, is part of the functional specification for how a product or a system actually operates. So I think we're kind of at that point now where we will look at products and systems and say it's actually a requirement of those the computing systems and applications and services where performance actually is part of the function. So an example would be, as you're pointing out, some sort of purpose limitation or maybe storage limitation, or whatever the requirement is. And that the best thing would be to try to make sure that users understand that, as well as the product developers and legislators, regulators as well, that those are becoming more important as fundamental design requirements, safety, personal information safety requirements. And so, trickling that all the way down actually makes sense. So my encouragement here is that, yes, I think there's actually a tremendous amount of opportunity in the research space to develop that and understand what that looks like for cloud providers or application developers and so on.
So we are totally online. That is that privacy is becoming more important, and that enterprises luckily understand as privacy functionalities as well, kind of first-class members of their requirements catalog or so. But so I think it's just it helps a bit to understand that privacy mechanisms themselves also have secondary properties that need to be addressed more explicitly. So because when I can say that this and that and that mechanism produces a throughput overhead of 10%, so that I need 10% more machines and so on, then I can discuss with the legal department this bloody it depends question way more precisely, right? I can say, okay, using this mechanism would produce a 10% overhead, and using this mechanism, which is somewhat more privacy friendly, would produce a 33% overhead. Now tell me, are these numbers reasonable? And that's way better for the communication than just saying, it's slower but better. So and then we have all this integration thing, this smoothly integrating with DevOps practices, smoothly integrating with the stacks that are really used in industry, and not just a algorithm that is published in pseudocode, for instance.
So I think there's 2 points that we can raise from this discussion. I'm really glad that you guys, sort of are not sure whether or not to disagree or not, because that's the best kind of panel, right? Where there's possibly some tension here. I want to turn a question over to both Lawrence and to Sheila. And this comes from the Slack channel that we have for session 7. And it's, how do we bridge the gap between the language of privacy research and talking about business values? So I think as you guys started to develop this sort of, is privacy a function, the question of, how do you evaluate its ultimate value for the customers and for the business units really started to emerge. And then, we'll go from that question to one that I think you brought up at the very end there, Frank, which is, how do we start to serve privacy research that people are interested in and will read? And we'll get to that in a minute. But let's talk about business value first. So Sheila, why don't I turn that over to you? How do we talk about privacy in a value-laden and a business value sort of way?
Well, that's a big question. Let me see if I can answer it as succinctly as possible. It's what I said earlier. We are in transformation. Everything's connected. That means everything is driven with data. And remember the definition in GDPR, and let's just cite the CCPA. Personal data, personal information, a materially identical definition. Any data that relates or is relatable to an individual person or household. So it's pretty much everything. It's a pixel, it's a tag, it's a string of data. It's very hard, if not impossible, to achieve anonymity. I think in a practical, operational, commercial way, you achieve anonymity, at least today. And I'm looking at tech that ostensibly would pass the legal gates. You achieve it with aggregation. But where's the starting point, and how do you do the bridge, right? How do I instruct my product and engineering teams with the privacy stuff, right? I start with the value. Data is important. Data is everything. Data, in our context, is about people. Data deserves dignity, respect, accountability, security, control. And there are two sides to that, right? It's the data we use to connect, which is a very utility function. And it goes to fraud detection and prevention and securitization. And then there's, in my world, data that describes. So there you start with the two buckets and you explain that over to the engineers. And then you begin explaining the uses. But you've got to partner very closely with Lawrence's team, those thinkers and problem solvers and innovators, Stacy, and those thinkers and problem solvers and innovators, and Lawrence's field. So it's a coming together of the two disciplines. Is more like you have to have an anthropological perspective about people, about humans, about cultural values and social norms. It has to be translated into the field of computer science, and you have to come at all of these different disciplines. I'm going to lean heavily into Stacy's work, though, because machine learning and AI agents, little ones, bigger ones, specified ones, bespoke between two enterprises and a relational custom integration, or larger general ones, this is the field. Advanced algorithms is the field, and that is the big horizon, and that's where the transformation is really coming. I want to step back a minute and talk about Frank's work, and the ability to be meaningfully transparent is perhaps one of the biggest challenges of all. We have not solved that well yet. We're very hopeful, and it adds on things like consent strings. How do we communicate those things? How do we, limited use, the objects that control the usefulness, the usability of a data object in the data stream? How do we solve that with technology? I'm not sure, but I'm hoping that our academics and technologists, our data scientists, can bring me some stuff that I can use to close the gap between policy wonk people like me and the engineers and the product people that are really building our future and our tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sheila. We'll get to how those engineers should serve you back a way to understand that, because I'm not sure that research journals might be the best mechanism for that, but we'll touch that in a moment.
It is not.
No. Lawrence, let me tip that question back to you as we started with, how do we talk about privacy and privacy in terms of business value?
Sure. So, obviously, like Google's an interesting case. I won't talk about our business and all the products in any sort of specificity, but I think there's really just a general question about business value and personal data that we are all looking at. Like the couple things that are sort of interesting, I think, are there's really a big need to say and express to customers, enterprise or end users, consumer users, just to give a much better idea. And this really goes to the great need for transparency and user control. And the more that we can do that, the much better we are off. I'm pleased that there's increasing amounts of information that users can find about how business operates, whether it's the transparency of the data that they store within a business, or how the data is collected with labels, or how it might be processed. But it's still really challenging, right? I think even despite that, what we'll probably end up seeing is a proliferation of more kinds of data collection, more processing in the next year or 10 years. And I kind of worry that as fast as we're developing new mechanism on transparency, we're probably not quite getting enough knowledge or understanding of users. So I think that's a really great challenge that we have to get, move everybody, all the consumers and users up that curve as quickly as possible. So there's a great research challenge there. And I think, the reason I'm mentioning that is that with the transparency, I think the idea of what sort of business value becomes more self-evident. There's another thing that I think is super interesting, which is that the ways that we do our processing today is it's not always super obvious, right? Because we put in notices or we get consents, I mean, that's sort of the, you know, baseline for a lot of types of legal bases of processing. But, you know, asking somebody to consent to something isn't always that great. I'm much more of a fan of just saying, hey, if you have a product and you can see what your data is and you can manipulate it and modify it and delete it and see it and, you know, perform some action and you know what you've got, that's much better. So that's great. So we should try to do that as much as possible, just to make, you know, data use more transparent within whatever context. When it's not possible, though, I mean, you'll have situations where, and I think this is sort of an ongoing question for many businesses. There will be cases where things like the collective behavior of individuals often requires some amount of personal information, and then the question is, you know, is that of great public benefit, social benefit to the business? I think the answer is yes, right? You can do both. You just have to be pretty clear about what the data is that you're using and how you process it. So, you know, we're obviously fans of that. We love to do the crowdsourcing thing, and, you know, we also don't require that you have to collect all that information permanently or maybe even at all. And so, you know, I think that's possible to have really good business value and give people a lot of choice too. So, well, I think there's just still a great amount of research that can be done there as well.
I'm going to jump back in, Sarah, and say transparency is really, really important, but there are really a couple of different flavors of transparency. The one that meets your legal obligations that regulators care about. And then there's one that really meets the expectation of people, that people would want to see and know so they could participate fully, right? And I know this has been long talked about in the field of privacy. I don't know that we've solved it yet, but I think there is work that makes the complexity more consumable. And I've seen some really cool new stuff that gamifies it, that gives it essentially a marketing, like how does it become consumable for people? How can they understand it? What's meaningful for them? The other backdrop of all that is a great deal of research. You know, I'm going to refer to Dr. Alan Weston's seminal work that breaks down the population. Do they even care? And before that, there was a piece of Worthland research that came at that issue. Do people care? What do people really want? And you know, the Weston work broke people into unconcerned pragmatists and fundamentalists. And we know what those stats are. Not everybody cares. A lot of people don't care. A lot of people understand value exchange. But the underlying premise that we've all got to remember is, regardless of, and I think, Lawrence, you brought up the consent, and I think there's a lot of noise right now and awareness that consent is a false narrative, but people want a safe, efficient, competitive, trustworthy marketplace. They want trustworthy technology. So that means that we, the users, the innovators, we've got to innovate ways that we are trustworthy, accountable in the use of their data. So this is very important, and transparency is a part of it, but it's not all of it.
And I think that's what's interesting is when we start talking about transparency, we often turn to the end user, right? To ultimately the people whose data we're using. But there's a secondary challenge here, and that's really, how do we actually create a pathway for transparent dissemination of the research that Stacy or Frank, or their many colleagues are doing, that gets into your hands and, you know, at the product level, at the industry level, so you can decide, hey, is this something that I need to explore a little bit more about? So I wanted to flip the question over to our academics, and Stacy, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to pick on you, and that is that new assistant professor rank. You're about to enter that sort of tenure pipeline where somebody's going to be counting the papers you've got, right, the rankings and your citation metrics, and there's a whole infrastructure for determining how your papers, et cetera, are going to be graded. But sometimes, well, archive is wonderful, and none of us would be here without it, but it may not be the best way to communicate. From your perspective, what's the best way that you think a computer scientist like yourself can communicate your research up and out to someone like Sheila or to Lawrence?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways that have been effective in my experience, though maybe not solving the whole gap, if you will. The first is actually partnerships, right? If an industry leader has a problem that they think is interesting, could be transformative if they had a solution, and they just don't have the people on staff or the know-how to address that problem in-house, they can go find researchers who are always looking to partner and looking for those ways that they can come together. And when you're in those rooms together, tackling a problem as one unit, that's where I think the best communication ends up happening. Of course, that's not on a broad scale, right? That's one problem at a time, one industry leader reaching out to one other academic, and that's not gonna bring everyone at scale. But to the scale, I think that it's sometimes we exist in different communities. The academics are preaching to the academics, going to conferences where they're just talking in the same foreign language to one another, all back and forth, people who generally agree with them because they're doing research in the same field. And then the industry, privacy, stakeholders are really going to a different set of venues and having a different set of conversations. I think the FPF had a great initiative where they were bringing researchers to conferences that the industry leaders were at. And when I was participating in this, I was surprised at the gap of what was considered privacy enhancing technologies between the researchers and the academic and the industry leaders who were just using a different set of tools. And it felt like, wow, we haven't been in the same rooms having the same conversations. So any way that those rooms, like this room, hopefully can be created, I think that helps you move that forward.
Yeah, obviously we couldn't agree more over here. But let me flip that over to Frank and ask you, what would you say is the way in which, obviously you've got a lot of stuff up on GitHub in terms of Tilt and some of your other research, but what are some of the ways in which you're trying to meet Lawrence, to meet Sheila, and meet people like that in terms of expressing your research?
Yeah. So first, I second that, what Stacy said. Working together with industry is highly valuable because first, you learn a lot about actual requirements, and second, you are able to demonstrate that there is something in for industry. Then there is one thing that we in academia have to deal with, that is we have our very own KPI system, which basically does not always motivate work that explicitly invests in being industry related or so. My answer to that is just do it anyway. And well, what I feel quite helpful is being active in social media. So I'm tweeting now and then, and that brings a lot of visibility across those boundaries, right? That is a strategy that I see, or that we are actually using. And one more thing is NGOs. So NGOs are often quite helpful in bringing together and organizing a very special kind of events where industry listens and wants to come instead of those typical academic conferences. And one more thing is that when we can demonstrate that our technologies are actually applicable in practice because they are easily adoptable and so on, and that they are increasing or actually helping regulatory compliance being implemented technically, then we have, at least in Europe, this wonderful concept of data protection by design obligations, saying basically when something is available as technology according to the state of the art and the effort to implement it in practice is reasonable, then you have to implement it. And that's something that we tell NGOs as well as our political representatives from ministries and so on, and then they can approach industry players and say, okay, we know there is something in the making, it seems to work, be aware you might have to adopt it sooner or later. And that's one thing that also helps a bit. Not much yet, but a bit.
Lawrence, let me send this question to you. So you sit on both sides, right? You've got your PhD, right? You've got that academic background, and you lead a team of people who are also from the same background. How is it that you would say, or your colleagues might say, that we should try to communicate best the privacy research side so that industry can understand? And how should industry communicate its problems back to, say, academics to try to form some of those partnerships that both Stacy and Frank were pointing to?
Yeah, we are, I mean, obviously, Google is a company with a lot of products, but I think we're actually looking at privacy and privacy engineering and research as an area that's greenfield in many ways. And so, I certainly encourage and work with a number of people who do core research, whether it's on HCI or computational, secure computing projects. And then, that kind of spans a really wide range. So I think I would encourage, colleagues of mine in the industry to do a fair bit to try to take problems that are real and practical and turn them into research-oriented problem statements with some solutions, and provide some empirical data, publish when possible. And there's just a tremendous number of academic conferences, this being sort of in the middle, but there's definitely a lot like SOUPs and PETs, and then there's, I think, a different space too, which outside of just talking about, say, privacy research from, say, a more computer science perspective. I think we're really at the point now we probably want to also have more publication and discussion in some of those policy circles. The conferences like ICD PPC or the CPDP, right? They're great. You have tech experts from data protection authorities. You have lawyers. You have engineers. They definitely need to move up the curve on not just technology, but I think also just frameworks for thinking and to move beyond just a purely regulatory legislated space. I guess one thing that it just sort of stands out to me is that if you look at GDPR, some of the articles are really small. I mean, that's just the way laws are written, right? They're incredibly minute and they're very sparse in the number of words, but the amount of engineering work that we have to go through to translate that into something that becomes, internal design standard or policy or, design documents, architectures is huge. And, it would be much, much better if we could also just get a little bit more of how we do these things practically in engineering, and then, engage, with legal scholars as well as, people who are working in academic research as well. There's one more thing I think I would add, which is I think there's a really great place for open source and standards, which is starting to become a little bit more prevalent. We try to provide privacy enhancing technologies, differential privacy libraries, different kinds of mechanisms as much as possible. I think they're done with great effect, and when that can be shared, it actually boosts everything up, because you can do it from a research side and contribute code. You can do it from a product side and increase that and adopt it and introduce it into your own system. It's got a great property of being transparent because everybody can see exactly what's going on in the code itself. So we should also promote those sorts of mechanisms too.
Yeah, don't underestimate common language, Sheila, common tools, Lawrence, right? Or open source tools, right? And pathways for communication, like social media, like being able to attend conferences like this to bring people like y'all together in one room. So realizing that it's now 1:44, we have till 1:45. I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of you for being here this afternoon and for sharing your insights. I think we've all learned a lot, and I'm really pleased that we got to finally meet each other. So for everyone who is here as part of the PEPR attendees, just an info point for you. A networking break is starting now. There is a Zoom that you should see up here in the chat. It's different. We've got birds of a feathers going on. You should see some of the Slack sessions. I encourage you, if you have any questions about this, to join some of those Slack sessions. Anyway, thank you so much, Sheila. Thank you so much, Edward, Stacy, and Frank. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.